Hey there everyone and welcome. I am Jeff and this is Tabletop Toolbox. If this is your first time joining me here on the channel, well then welcome. I'm happy to see you here. This is a channel dedicated to modern hobby tabletop board games, card games, strategy games, and so much more. And this is a special treat, something I've been wanting to do for a long time. I haven't done these in a while. This is going to be a Tabletop Toolbox Top 10 Game Series. This is something that I haven't done since June of 2021, where I took a look at my top 10 favorite games that I don't own. And I watched that video just earlier today, and wow, that one was pretty rough. I've certainly come a long way in the past 3 years. This particular video is going to be the top 10 games that I wish came out when I was younger. This is an idea that I am flagrantly stealing from the Dice Tower. They did this last year called Top 10 Games I Wish I Had as a Teenager. I thought it was a really neat theme, and I actually reached out to Tom and asked if I could do a series of that on the channel since I contribute to the Dice Tower, and he said, nah, that's okay. So guess what? I'm going to do it here a year later because I started a list. I had 9 games on that list, and finally the other day figured out my 10th. So hey, you know what? With all that being said, let's kick things off. Before I kick things off with number 10, there are 2 topics I want to discuss, just to kind of help put you into my mindset as I approach this list. First of all, with every game on this list, I wanted to consider 2 things. Is it a game that if I saw it as a kid, as a child, and I'm thinking, you know, early teens to sort of mid to late teens, that sort of middle school, high school range, would it be something that I would want to get into? When I was a kid, I played a little bit of video games. I got into that more in middle school and high school. I'll talk about that in just a second. I was sort of into TV, but not that much, so there weren't a lot of IPs that would really have interested me back then. A few, and you'll see them. The other thing that I kind of asked was, if I played the game, would it make me want to, A, play that game again, and would it make me want to look into other games? Would it have surprised me to think, oh, I didn't know there were games like this? And so, you know, I would then pursue the hobby a little bit more. And all these games are not older games. These are not games that existed back in that era. These are games that have come out since then. And I kind of wish maybe that I had run into them when I was younger. That was topic 1. Topic number 2 is someone that you're going to hear about a lot in this list. Back in middle school and high school, my best friend in the world, his name was Doug. And Doug now lives just a few hours from me. We still keep in touch. But we did a ton of stuff together as a kid. We were in the band together. We played a lot of video games together. His family was very, well, we're going to say nerdy. I think that's an honest term we can use. His brothers were very big into computers. His dad was kind of big into the computers, and that got Doug kind of into it. He wasn't really as dedicated to it, if you will. He just liked to play the games. And so a lot of the games that I was playing, a lot of the video games I was playing back in that time frame are still games and themes that I'm interested in today. And that is going to be my precursor into number 10, which is Anno 1800. This is a city building game. This is from Martin Wallace and Cosmos. This is a adaptation of a video game, of a city building video game. Now, back in my middle school, high school days, I played a lot of SimCity. And there are some other SimCity themed games. I'm thinking like Suburbia, which I considered for this list as well. For Anno 1800, the reason I picked this one specifically is because it is an adaptation of a video game. There is not an actual SimCity board game. If there was, it would probably be on this list, even if I didn't like it as a game. Anno 1800, I very, very much enjoy. I have played the video game of this actually after I played the board game, and I then realized just kind of how loyal this is to the video game, although they are very different. Anno 1800 is a real-time city building sort of civilization management game. It's actually more than just a city builder. It's a civilization type game, a 4X game, if you will. And while obviously you can't get all of those ideas into a board game, this does give you that impression of trying to work in the supply chain. Supply chain is a big aspect of the video game, and that you have to have the smaller products to support the bigger products. You need to have the bigger products to support the population who can come in and manage the businesses of the even larger products, so on and so forth. In that game, you have to be able to then work with different localities. You actually have, certain islands that will generate certain products and certain islands that won't. And so you have to set up that supply chain to be able to then move those goods back and forth, not just between islands on one map, but you actually have to bring in other countries, other nationalities, like literally different parts of the world to supply some of the exotic goods, if you will, or just foreign goods that, again, keep that whole process running. And that's here. In a lot of ways, that's here. And I've really, really enjoyed this game. My only quibble for this is that it can be a little long. Even at 2 players, it can run a rather long game. But I have had a lot of fun playing Anno 1800, my number 10. Number 9 on this list is the game that was only recently added. It was that 10th game that I was kind of hem-hawing around on. And in fact, when I finally realized, oh yeah, this obviously was the game, it bumped itself up to number 9. This is the game that I have liked for quite a long time. I have gotten back into it lately with a new expansion that is on crowdfunding. Actually, as I record this, it's a game that I have done some video content here on the channel, which has been very, very popular. And if you've been watching it, you probably know what this game is. This is Dinogenics, the Park Manager Edition, as part of the New Arrivals expansion. This is Jurassic Park in a box. And Jurassic Park came out in 1993. I was in high school, I think, right around then. And I've always sort of been interested in that theme. I read the early Jurassic Park books, a big Michael Crichton fan. And so, yeah, this is managing a dinosaur park in a box. And you can have a lovely park with dinosaurs and their pens, and you can have guests and amusements and hotels and all kinds of things and sort of running a business. But you can also run that business on the shady side if you want. You can steal DNA, you can infest your opponent's hotels, you can kind of run a little amok within the engine of this game, and I think that's what makes it so much fun. You get some really clever opportunities to do some really clever things. I love the presentation of this game. I love the way that it looks. I love the way that it plays. It's a worker placement style game. And I've got a lot of content already here on the channel about this, so I'm not going to dive into this really very deep into this video, or in this video, but Dinogenics is a fantastic game, number 9 on this list. Number 8 is a little bit of a pinch hitter. This one, maybe not a perfect fit for this list. However, when I was younger, again, playing a lot of video games, I liked a lot of car-themed games. And I think of the stunts game that we used to play, where you were, driving cars and trying to do loop-de-loops and jumps and tricks. I also played a game called Death Race, I believe it was called, and you're actually going to see a little bit of that here coming up in a moment. But this one is Reality Shift. Now, this is a fairly obscure board game, and in this game you've got a bunch of these plastic cubes with metal tiles on the inside. Each player has a little sort of a car bike type thing, almost looks like something out of the movie of Tron, and you're moving these pieces around these 3D cubes trying to get from a start point to an end point. The tracks are very random, and not only is the track set up random, but the play is very random. You're playing cards and using a die to determine your movement value of each turn, but then those cards may also let you actually move these cubes in that 3D environment. You can slide them over, you can pivot them, you can rotate them, you can possibly even use them to crush your opponents in between those moving cubes, resetting them back to the start point on the track. And it's a very silly game. It's a very chaotic game. It can sometimes be a little frustrating. It can also sometimes be very, very fast. I have seen it run a little on the long side, but pretty rarely. I don't know if I would have loved this as a kid. I think that randomness, I think that unpredictability would have frustrated me as a child, because it can sometimes frustrate me as an adult. But I do think that the components of this, the looks of it, the silliness of it would have been appealing to me as a child. And so that's why I have picked Reality Shift as my number 8. Now, you may not have realized from the beginning of this video that I've had something very large and very heavy leaning against the side of this table, and I've had it here staged for this, my number 7, which is Crokinole. This is a dexterity game, and it's kind of ironic because this game was out when I was a child. This game dates back to something like the 1700s, coming from Canada, and it is a simple dexterity game. We are trying to get discs into this central hole. However, if you have any opponent's discs on the board, you must first reflect your shot or hit one of their discs before you can then work towards that center hole. That's it. And as kids, we were always introduced to dexterity games. I played lots of air hockey and, as I mentioned, Mousetrap, and just those kinds of games that are sort of puzzle-based dexterity, very tactile experiences. And I think had I seen this as a kid, I would have played the daylights out of it. This particular board came from a company called Wooden out of Greenville, South Carolina. I haven't talked to them in a number of years, although I know that they are still out there, and I would highly recommend purchasing a board from them if it is something that you're interested in. These things come in a wide range of prices. You can get them kind of cheap, but you're definitely going to get what you pay for. This one was a bit more expensive, but you can see it's a beautiful board. We love this thing quite a bit. It's been fairly well played. I mean, from this in the light, I can see some very light scratches and such in it, but I can actually polish those out pretty easily. Anyways, a very, very fun game. We'll often break this out when we're having just casual get-togethers at the house. You can play this fairly quickly, and what's funny is that at the amateur level that we tend to play at, it just becomes a hilarious experience because you can miss very, very simple shots that you think, no problem whatsoever, I'll shoot it in between those pegs, hit that peg out, hit that disc out of the way and nail the center disc, and then your shot just completely flies off the board. And it makes it so funny and entertaining. Anyways, a very, very great game. My number 7, Crokinole. My number 6 is definitely inspired by my years of high school lunch breaks. In high school, we had 50 minutes for lunch. We would eat our lunch, and then we would sit there and we would play card games. And most of the time what we played was the game of spades. Now, spades is a trick-taking game. Everyone pretty much knows that. But in the case that you don't, you were simply playing a single card into a trick of cards. It was pretty much always a 4-player game, at least as I always knew of it. And so you would have an opening suit. Someone would play a card from their hand, whether it was a diamond, hearts, clubs, or spades. And then everyone had to try and play that same suit of card. And if they didn't, they could then play a different card. If they played a spade, they would then beat whatever that first suit was. And so you're trying to play the highest card of either the opening suit or a spade. And if you then won that trick, you'd collect those cards in front of you, and each trick that you collected was worth a point. And there were some other rules that I'm probably forgetting about. We played the crap out of that. It makes me kind of wish that we had Cat in the Box back then. This is the same premise, except for that instead of those suits, you're just using colors, red, blue, yellow, and green. Except for that the cards are all black. There's no colors on the cards. When you play a card, you choose which color it is. You say this is a 3 and it's a blue 3, and you put a little token out on a board to sort of remind everyone that the blue 3 has been played. Now later on, when you're following a suit, you can decide that you don't have that suit anymore. And so if someone plays a 4 and they say it's a blue 4, maybe you don't want to deal with blues anymore. So you just kind of say, well, I'm out of blues, and so I'm going to play the red. The red is the equivalent of the spade. It is the suit that wins all other conflicts. And so you can say, well, I'm going to play a red 2, which then means that you have to be out of blue cards, which you simply indicate by removing a token from a little card in front of you tracking the 4 colors that you no longer have available. Later on, though, if you're left with a card, let's say you have a 6 in your hand, and you look at that central board that indicates all the colors that have already been played, and the only one left is a blue 6. It's the only 6 that hasn't been played, and it's what you have in your hand. Well, then you have created a paradox. You have created a situation where you cannot play that card because you have already indicated that you are out of blue cards, and that is the only card that would be able to be played would be the blue 6. And the world implodes, and you lose the trick, and everything kind of goes downhill. It's a very, very interesting game. It's one of those games where you almost just kind of have to start playing a couple of rounds because it's very hard to explain. It's very hard for people to kind of wrap their head around this idea of you not only are choosing the card to play, but what that card can mean. And then the downstream implications of those plays can get very, very heady very, very quick. I don't really enjoy this game so much today. I've kind of moved on from trick-taking games, but I think it's brilliant. And I have certainly played, this can actually play anywhere from 2 to, I believe, 5 players. It doesn't work too well at 2. I would not recommend this as a 2-player game, but 3 and up certainly gets a bit more interesting. I certainly wish I had this as a kid. I think we would have played the daylights out of this thing. Cat in the Box, my number 6. But number 5 is another dexterity game, and it is also sort of harking back to that concept I mentioned about loving car games and racing games. Like, I played a ton of Gran Turismo in high school. My friend Doug had a PlayStation, and I would always go over to his house. I would play until he would fall asleep on the couch, and then I'd let myself out at like 1 in the morning. I played a ton of racing games, and that's why I've got Pitch Car on this list. Now, real quick, this is the Pitch Car Mini. There is another sort of a full-scale version of Pitch Car. I started to collect Mini a couple years ago because my daughter was quite young, and I thought that the smaller pieces and the smaller track might kind of level the playing field for her a little bit. I do think if I ever get the chance, I'm going to go and collect some more of the standard Pitch Car. Anyways, this is a dexterity game. It uses pieces actually very similar to that of Crokinole, which I mentioned earlier, and you're simply flicking these wooden discs around wooden track pieces, guided by one guardrail on either side. And there are even some deluxe pieces of this that can introduce things like loop-de-loops and bridges, four-way intersections, all kinds of craziness. We played this a ton when my daughter was younger. We honestly haven't played it as much nowadays, but it is still a delightful experience. I often go to Dice Tower conventions where they will set up huge displays of this, and it is just always a ton of fun. It's a little harder to get. Sometimes it goes out of print. It can also be quite expensive because of that wooden, component of it. But I would certainly recommend this if you want something a little lighter, something that's just very goofy to get out and play with. It can be a little tedious sometimes to set up the tracks, but you can play this with family members of any age. The rules of this are incredibly simple. You're just flicking these pieces around, and it is always a ton of fun. Pitch Car, my number 5. Number 4 is the only game on this list. Now, this one's a real stretch, but let me explain it. I don't have this game, and I have never played this game. I have looked into it. I've never had a chance to play it. A couple times I've seen it at conventions. It was either just sort of a demo thing sort of set up, or people were already playing it. I just kind of watched. I know what it does for the most part. I know how it works, and I certainly know its theme. It is the game of Car Wars. Now, as I mentioned, I played a ton of video games with my friend Doug, and one of the games that we played, this was actually back in middle school, was a game called Death Race. This was, like a DOS-based, even before we had Pentium processors. This game is ancient, and you would drive around these very, very pixelated little cars, and you were shooting missiles, shooting machine guns, dropping caltrops. I always remember caltrops, sort of these spiky things you would drop on the road to then shred the cars behind you. And there was a bit of a campaign mode to it. You were upgrading your cars. You could, purchase armor and better engines and just try to max out your cars. And I had so much fun playing this as a child. And when I saw Car Wars and I saw what it did, I thought, man, I would love to play this, except for that I don't know anyone who I could really reliably play it with. And it is also absurdly expensive, at least these latest versions. And so it's always just kind of kept it out of my reach. I actually still want a chance to play this because I can definitely tell you that if I'd seen this as a kid, I'd have been interested in it 100% as I still am today. Anyways, that is Car Wars, a bit of a stretch for my number 4. Number 3 on this list is the first intellectual property, the first, game based on maybe a TV show or a movie or something like that. And this is certainly the case for Transformers, the deck building game. This is by Renegade, and of course the license is with Hasbro Games. Now, first and foremost, this isn't a very good game. I'm going to be honest with you. This is a deck building game where players are, at least in this particular edition of the game, they represent the Autobots, the good guys, Optimus Prime, Bumblebee, and more. And they're trying to move around this sort of matrix, a grid of face-down cards. There is no board to this. You're just playing on a bunch of cards. And you're trying to recruit other Autobots. You're trying to recruit various allies, in this case, usually human characters from the old TV shows and whatnot. You're trying to collect relics. You can go to some various locations. And all the while you're trying to whoop up a little bit of Decepticon ass. You've got the various enemies that will pop up in the game, even some of the bosses that will pop up. Blanking on their names at the top of my head. You got Starscream, you've got Megatron, and more. But the rules of this are really, really poorly written. It is a very, very difficult rule book to get through. The whole process of fighting some of these enemies is very poorly explained, and it can be a tedious game to teach. and introduce especially to new players. However, I've always had a lot of fun with it. I love the fact that you can transform between your robot mode and your alt mode, vehicle mode, whatever it may be, and you kind of have different abilities when you're in different forms. You can move a little quicker when you are in your alternate mode. And so despite its issues, and it's got a lot of issues, I have still had a lot of fun with this. Now, the other thing I will say is that there are 3 different base games to this. As I said, this is the original mode where you're playing as the Autobots. There's another mode where you're playing as the Decepticons, and there's even a third version which kind of has both in the same box. There are also 3 different expansions. Now, the good news is you can get all of it, because there is no real duplicates. I think there may be 2 different Bumblebees across all the different boxes. But other than that, you don't get a whole lot of duplicate content across all those different editions of the game. But as you acquire more of that stuff, you get even more rules. The rulebook of the latest edition is a little better, just a little bit. The expansions definitely weigh the game down and add all kinds of just messy stuff that you cannot just simply add into these boxes. You have to replace stuff across the different versions. Anyways, I would recommend looking for just one of these larger box, one of the standalone expansions, they call it. Any of these will work for you. And if you want to play, of course, as the Decepticons, you're going to need the 2nd edition. And if you want to be able to play as both, you're going to need the 3rd, so on and so forth. Anyways, I would definitely have checked this out as a kid. I probably would have never gotten through the rule book. If I'm honest, I would have needed someone to teach this to me. But as a big fan of Transformers as a child, I would have loved to play Transformers, the deck building game, my number 3. Okay, number 2 is on this list because of my number 1 on this list, which obviously you'll see in a moment. Now, at some point, and it was kind of in maybe high school, I couldn't even exactly tell you when, I started to take a big interest in space. Now, I grew up watching Star Trek. I never really got into Star Wars, no offense to anybody. And of course, as I have mentioned, I played a lot of card games when I was in high school. And so I think that had I been introduced to this game, had I known about this game, I might have just taken a look at Star Realms. This is another deck building game, and today I'm a huge fan of deck building games. And of course, this is set in a just completely made up space warfare sort of story. I don't even know that there is much of a story to this, but each player starts off with a identical deck of cards, and they can then start purchasing new cards, adding new ships and new abilities to their deck. They then engage in these sort of epic space battles, and you're just trying to whittle away the health of 1 or more opponents. The base game was just a 2-player game. This now plays up to 4 at least, if not more. I don't quite remember. This one says 4. There's a ton of expansion content for this. You can actually waste quite a lot of money on this game if you want to. But I've always had a lot of fun with it. Again, I don't know how much I would have been into that conflict necessarily of this game. I can stomach it obviously now today, but younger me may not have been quite so much into getting my ass kicked by a big space fleet. But I still think I would have given it a shot. Star Realms, my number 2. All right, before I get into my number 1, I've got a little funny honorable mention that I want to give here, because the game I have sitting here to my right did exist when I was a child. It came out in 1982, 1983, somewhere in there. It is a theme, it is an IP actually, that is still today my favorite IP of all time. It is a game that I know of is the only game of this IP, of this theme, ever made. And this is, again, from 82, the Knight Rider board game. I love Knight Rider. I still love Knight Rider today. I was watching the DVDs just a week or so back. And again, this game is from 1982. This is a Parker Brothers game. I got this off of eBay a bunch of years ago. I have never played it. In fact, the cards inside are still in their punch board. Yes, paper cards in a punch board. I read the rules of it, and it looks atrocious, which should not be any surprise to anyone who regularly watches this channel or any other modern board game content. I really should play this. I really do want to give this a play, but I will tell you, if any other Knight Rider themed board game ever comes out, I will buy it. No questions asked. It'll be in this collection. So anyways, this is my honorable mention, Knight Rider. Now, for my number 1, I'll tell you another quick story, and I'm actually going to show you another game that I used to play a lot as a child. This is Star Trek, the collectible card game. My good friend Doug, who I mentioned a couple times here already, Him and I would play this game constantly at lunch in high school, kind of towards our junior, senior years. By then, I had a job, I was making a little bit of money, and I could afford to go to the store and pick myself up some of these collectible card game pieces. And I really liked this game. This was a fun game. It's got some flaws to it, and it actually had so many expansions come out for it that it bloated to the point that then they made a second edition. They made a couple expansions for that before the Decipher company abandoned the game altogether. You can still play this online, and I actually still occasionally collect some components for the Star Trek game. But it is the inspiration for my actual number one, the fairly large Star Trek Fleet Captains. This is from WizKids game. This is a 2-player only game where players will represent a fleet of either Federation or Klingon ships. There was also a Romulan expansion and a Dominion expansion. I have both of those as well. This game is quite out of print, unfortunately. If you're trying to find this, you're going to have to spend a decent amount of money. But this is a 2-player only game, as I mentioned, and what I really, really like about this game is that you start off sort of choosing a fleet of ships. Those ships will then dictate which cards you draw from these decks of either combat, science, maybe exploration. I can't quite remember all of the themes of those cards, but it will dictate which cards you draw, and those cards then establish your missions that you're trying to work towards throughout this game. And on your turn, you'll be activating your ships, moving them around, trying to explore, trying to accomplish these missions, maybe getting involved in combat, especially if you're on the Klingon side of things. And again, with those Romulan and Dominion expansions, there are all kinds of clever things that start to pop up with some extra cards, some extra things that those expansions added. And it's simply a race to get various missions done. Those missions are worth points to you, and so it's a race to get to a certain number of points. I really enjoy this game. The component quality is absolutely terrible. The ships are terrible. The cards are these really thin, weird stock. And in fact, a lot of you've got star bases and planetary components and such that are just represented by thin cardboard. I went and 3D printed all these sort of larger, more deluxe pieces. Some of them I even designed myself to try and give the game a little bit more table presence. I don't get to play this very often. Obviously, a 2-player Star Trek theme is not something that a lot of folks are really interested in these days, but every time I play this, I am in my own way sort of transported back to those high school days where Doug and I would sit there and play the collectible card game for just as long as we possibly could. Sometimes we'd play at home. And like I said, I still collect that game today. I have so much nostalgia for that game that when I finally got to play this and check this game out, it just reminds me so much of a much more involved, much more modern hobby board game interpretation of that Star Trek collectible game. And that's why it is my number one, and I really appreciate you checking out this list. Hope you've seen some new stuff, maybe some things that you didn't know about, and I would love to know what games you wish came out when you were younger. Thanks again for watching, and folks, I'll see you again soon. Cheers.